So after Putin was foisted on Russians in 2000 as their new president, they also chose to elect him. His direct and coarse language, threats and intimation of violence attracted people and continued to do so for over 20 years. Russians' fetish for strong leaders and superficial social and political stability has now backfired spectacularly. Once he has ascended to power, we should not have been surprised that he stayed and refused to move on. Putin's model of authoritarian leadership always leads to tragedy and blood, humiliation and violence. So we get to February 22nd, when Russia dragged Ukraine and the world into its deep-rooted trauma and hell. The Silicon Curtain podcast has been created to explore issues around propaganda narratives and techniques and the threat they pose to societies. If you like the material we create, then please like and subscribe and share around with your friends and network. Our guest today is ideal to talk around propaganda narratives, their mechanisms and how they work. Peter Pomerantsev is a Soviet-born British journalist, author and TV producer. He is a senior fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics, where he co-directs the Arena programme. He is also an associate editor at Coda Media. He has written 2 books about Russian disinformation and propaganda, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, 2014, and This is Not Propaganda, 2019. Peter was born into a Russian-speaking Jewish family in Kiev in 1977. In 1978, he moved with his parents to West Germany after his father, broadcaster and poet Igor Pomerantsev, was arrested by the KGB for proliferating anti-Soviet literature. They later moved to Munich and then London, where Igor Pomerantsev worked for the BBC World Service. Peter, I've long wanted to have you on the channel and quiz you because you have a unique experience of Russia and, of course, the Russian informational space and media. Well, let's start for everyone in the audience who might not be aware. You've written 2 fantastic books. We'll put links to those in the video description afterwards. That you have a strong family connection, don't you, to Ukraine? Could you describe a little bit about yourself? That would be of interest to the audience.
Well, my connection to Ukraine is around, I don't know, quite deep, around 6 foot deep, the depth of a grave, really. I mean, I'm from Ukraine, and all my ancestors are buried there, and I was born there. I was born in Kiev in 1977, but my parents were political dissidents, and in 1978 they were thrown out of the USSR. My father had been arrested for the heinous crime of giving censored books to his friends, for which in those glorious days of the Soviet Union you got 7 and 5, so 7 years prison, 5 years Siberia. But or you were thrown out, or you were exiled, which might sound like a strange choice for people, but actually a lot of people wanted to stay and fight the good fight, and quite a lot of my dad's friends who were arrested with him stayed and have gone on to have important political careers in Ukraine. He was a poet. He wasn't that interested in a political career, and he decided to leave, which really means leaving and never seeing your family again, never seeing your friends again, never seeing where you were raised again, with $200 I think you're allowed to take. So it's you're a political refugee. But after my family left the Soviet Union, my father quite quickly, well, after a couple of years wandering around Europe, got a job at the BBC. And I grew up accidentally British. I'm very British, as you can hear, but it's a complete accident, which I've always been very aware of. I could have been a little German if my dad had elected to do the PhD at Mainz University he'd been offered, or a little American, which is what most of my father's friends, because many of them emigrated, became. And I now live in Washington, D.C. Maybe I've got there now. So it really was just because the BBC gave my dad an offer. I mean, the British weren't actually taking Soviet refugees then. Very, very strict quotas.
That seems odd. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. There was a tiny Soviet emigre community in London that I kind of grew up in, but it was tiny. And nothing like growing up in New York in the Russian community. So that probably anglicized me more. I don't know. I didn't have anything else. And I only really went back to Ukraine after I I think it was either just before I went to university or just after. I can't remember now. These are either 18 or 22, one of the two. I have to recall. I need to go through my notes. But really very late, probably 18. It was probably, no, I think it was afterwards, 22. I was 22 when I went to Ukraine for the first time. And it felt uncannily like coming home.
Which
really
year was that?
See, I don't know. It must have been one of my universities. It can't have been when I was 22. I was younger.
Mm.
I was younger because I remember wandering around and still being amazed at, still being really shy around women because I'd been in an all-boys school. By the time I'd finished university, that shyness had gone. So I must have been a bit younger. I'm just thinking of myself at that age.
Yeah.
I was still quite awkward. So I don't know. But we're talking what? Late 90s? Late 90s? And a quick visit. So we still had family there. We still have family there, lots. So that's where I went, and I just always felt uncannily at home in Kiev, really, and in Odessa, which is where most of my family is from. My father grew up in Chernivtsi in the west of Ukraine, where I still have family. But then I lived in Moscow from 2001, 2010. I was very, I wanted an adventure somewhere after university, and Moscow was one of the places to have that adventure. It was a city already brimming with evil, really, which I try to then describe in my book. But at the age of 22, evil feels like fun.
It's mentally stimulating, even if it's not an ideal holiday destination. Yeah.
I left. I was there 9 years, and I left for many reasons. 9 years is more than enough in one place, and I left because I left in 2010. It was already clear for me that something was deeply, deeply wrong in the society, and it was heading towards dictatorship. You could already see the signs. But I also left because I had kids, and I didn't want my kids growing up in that environment. So I took them back to London.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I can absolutely appreciate that. And there were many people who asked me, including friends in Russia, why did you choose to go back? Because I studied in Russia and then went to live after my university degree. And many people say, well, look, you can make a lot more money here. You could get on a lot faster. You could buy your own apartment far quicker. And I seem to remember at the time telling people that everything you earn, everything you invest in, everything you create could be taken from you in the bat of an eyelid. And that was met with derision. And of course, this year, we're seeing that not only are people's livelihoods and everything they've accumulated and invested their lives in being taken away from them almost instantaneously, they've now got their lives being taken away through the enforced conscription. Does any of this come as a surprise to you from your experiences?
What a good question. I still think there's shock. I still think there's shock among some people. But to be honest, when I was there, I was very much an expat and a Westerner with, I could speak decent Russian, so I had a sort of insight into the society. But, the Russians never, always treated me. They'd always assumed I'd sort of emigrated in the 90s rather than the 70s, but they very much saw me as not having grown up there. They could sense that straight away. So I was quite naive there with the first years, especially. I kind of brought into, especially in the first years, the idea that Russia was moving towards being a democracy of sorts. And to be honest, it was my Russian friends in the arts, in business, who were always telling me, you don't get it. This is going to become a full-on dictatorship again. They were always hedging their bets. So you're saying that people always knew everything could be taken away, and they were always hedging their bets. That's why so much money leaves Russia. They were always very aware. They were always very keen to get second passports, always very keen to have a backup plan. They're like, you can't, the people who are in charge are bad. Now, that doesn't mean that most of them still didn't think that Putin would invade Ukraine or anything. They thought, simply because that's in many ways, not an irrational thing to do in terms of winning, not in terms of ethics, but just in terms of winning, it's an irrational thing to do. So many of them were surprised that he did something so unwise. But no, my Russian friends were the ones who were always like, this can disappear in a second, and always knew it. It was actually the Westerners who kept on believing in it. and who kept on investing in it and would buy apartments, and then thugs would come up and take the apartment away, and they'd been shot. They're like, but there's a rule of law, and the thugs would be like, where the rule of law? And then be like, well, I'll tell the mayor. I went to a party with the mayor, and they're like, no, where from the mayor? Like, so as the Westerners were naive, the Russians always got it and exploited it, and always had a plan B.
And you worked in the media, didn't you? You worked within the television industry, so you must have seen at close quarters how the Russian state was clawing back control of the media.
Yes, so I was there from 2000 to 2010. The first 4 years, I did lots of things. I was very young. I went to film school there. I worked on BBC and Discovery documentaries about Russia. Then 2006, 2010, I worked basically a production company set up by a British guy, which made Western entertainment formats for Russian entertainment TV. So reality shows. So the company I worked for made Top Gear,
Top Gun, that kind of right? Yes, slightly different format.
No, they made like Top Gear and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Come Dine With Me, all those sort of things, which was really interesting. So I was actually much more exposed to the entertainment side, and most of the networks that I worked with were pure entertainment networks. So the state was pretty hands off on that. Actually, a lot of people were kind of flooding away from news into entertainment and glossy magazines, because you still have complete creative freedom there. So no, it was a very strange compromise in the sense that you could do whatever you liked, as long as these were entertainment channels, so you weren't going to do politics anyway, but as long as you didn't touch politics. So we were doing very subversive stuff about, trying to sort of mainstream LGBT people, like getting them on screen. So everybody was really into that kind of social change. But yes, political change was being cut off. And the fact that people were pouring into glossy magazines. So Esquire became the magazine for a while, because all these great journalists couldn't write couldn't work on TV news anymore. So they came and worked for these glossy magazines. So in that sense, there was like, the state was saying, this is ours. The main TV channels are ours. The news is ours. Don't touch this. And it came by stages. First they got rid of one channel, then another channel. Then there were still pockets of good current affairs left, and slowly every one of those would be destroyed. So it happened in stages. And I think some of the last stuff was around when I was leaving, like 2010-ish. There's a couple of, I think Ren TV was still going, still had good news there. And they edited up over between 2001 and 2010. But they were allowing you to have a lot of freedom in the arts, a lot of freedom in entertainment, where you could do very, very interesting things. And that was the deal. And frankly, a lot of people were happy with the deal. I remember talking with a lot of my Russian friends, and they were like, well, not a bad deal, made tons of money. I wasn't making any money, but definitely Russian producers and stuff who are. And they were like, we stick out of their business, they stick out of our business. And that was a sort of a very cynical compromise. The lines had become very blurred. Former dissidents were working with the Kremlin was working with the reality show producers. Everything was sort of mixed up. Socially, people go to the same bars. And I mean, that was the world I tried to describe in my first book, because of course, underneath this sort of loose cynicism was a deep, deep, deep moral depravity. And beneath that, this sort of lava of trauma that was just waiting to explode. And now it has. And by trauma, I mean sadism and masochism and all those sort of things.
Deep-seated trauma. And, it's not pushing it too far to say that you can trace this trauma all the way back to the Middle Ages and the Mongol Horde, which basically, raped the country for decades or centuries in a row. And then what Russians inflicted on each other and now subsequently their neighbors. I think that is quite misunderstood, isn't it? How traumatized and deeply confused, perhaps, and even a little lost Russians are, because you describe in your book, I think very interestingly, the fact that people would try on new ideas, new identities in the way that other people would try on new clothes and styles. Almost sort of postmodern, post-truth, you can be anything and nothing at the same time.
Yes, which reveals a kind of a horrible moral emptiness at the core of it. There's So, I wouldn't be too pitying. I mean, Russia is strange in that it is often both the perpetrator and the victim. But, when we look at the biographies of mass murderers, they often have some pretty messed up childhood. So let's not start absolving the Russian state and Russian political culture, and to a certain extent, Russian social culture in being an aggressor, because they don't just do it to themselves. This is an empire that has never for a moment, not for a moment, wanting to be anything but an empire, and which sees as its divine right to genocide others. And so this is not just internal trauma. What's interesting is that they lock their own people up as well. But so did the Nazis. The Nazis had arrested many Germans and put them in concentration camps, even as they turned on the Jews. So these things often go together, internal and external. But what was really striking in my time in Russia, and this was actually apparent not even from my TV work so much, but I used to just do little projects for the European Union and stuff when I was there. When I was at film school, I kind of funded it by working as a consultant for various EU development programs. And I remember sort of going to the regions a lot and drinking with people in, regional businesses and regional administrations. And from the early 2000s, when I was going there, I mean, a few drinks in, you'd be like, oh, we're taking it all back. This is all ours. Let's divide Europe together, us and the EU. And I'd be like, well, actually, the EU is not about empire building, despite what some people in Britain say. It's it's about sort of rules and all this stuff. And they're like, yeah, whatever. We'll make up some rules. Well, let's carve up Europe together. Let's get rid of the Americans. Or with the Americans, let's carve up Europe together. Not for a moment did they stop thinking about the world as a dog-eat-dog place where might is right. And not for a moment did they relinquish their belief that their right is to crush others. And that never went away. I don't really think there was a romantic moment when that went away. I think even in the early 1990s, when there were democratic aspirations, I don't think there was any serious aspirations to get over the legacy of being an empire. And we can tie that to trauma. Humiliated cultures want to humiliate others. We could get into the political psychology that informs this need to crush others in a way that does not reflect rational self-interest. Yeah, this is not a sort of like, oh, let's expand our economic might by creating the East India Company sort of empire building. This is completely self-destructive empire building. It's what psychoanalysts would call secondary narcissism, when you want things you don't need and that actually destroy you because there's some deep lack of something, attention, love, self-respect in the middle of it all, and often very self-destructive. I think this is what we also have to understand. We talk of Russia as living off, empire building, but this is not 19th century empire building a la France and Britain, which is embedded in a theory of rational self-interest. This is a self-destructive empire building, which is much weirder, pulling everybody down to your own level, sucking them into the vortex of your own hell. Very, very different to the classic ideas of empire building. And that's something that's going to take a hell of a lot to get over.
I was going to try and unpick that because there's a curious similarity, maybe not so curious at all. One of the Nazi propaganda techniques was also the sort of play the aggressive victim, and that's something I think you see very closely in the Russian character, whether it comes through in terms of sort of passive nostalgia and a sense of loss of the Soviet Union, whatever, or as we're seeing currently now, an extremely aggressive victimhood that is blaming everyone for the aggression that is actively being inflicted. And it's not just a propagandist conceit, is it? I mean, it worked in Germany because of the deep-seated sense of betrayal after the First World War that was then sort of leveraged. And in Russia, you get the impression that they have this sense of loss, a sense of lost potential, which is potentially quite rational because there are several points in Russian history where they could have taken an alternative turn, where things could have turned out potentially differently or not taken the worst possible route, which seems to be another feature of Russian history, going for the absolute sort of worst case scenario each time. And I think Russians have this deep sense of a lost utopia. But the way it comes out, as you say, is in this aggressive victimhood, which I don't think too many people realize that characteristic is not just a propagandic conceit, but it exists inside millions of people's heads. It's extremely toxic.
Yeah, look, propaganda only works when it reverberates with what people with people's traumas and desires, and often unspoken desires. I mean, look, the victimhood thing, we saw Milosevic would do this as well. The Nazis famously, every Hitler speech or Goebbels speech starts with the whole world, especially the Jews, have conspired against us and forced us into this war. Same, the Russians is like, the main Russian propaganda line is, we have no choice. We were forced into this by the Great Conspiracy. I mean, there's several things to think about here. Firstly, I think Erich Fromm, the great German psychoanalyst, talks about the victim narrative in Nazi propaganda, basically saying that this is the classic thing of like, when bullies claiming victimhood, what they're actually saying, this is what we want to do to you. Yeah, this is, they're preparing the ground, say, we are the victim, we have been victimized, therefore I'm going to crush you. You know, it's the bully preparing the ground. We can also talk about, look, it's very classic as well among mass murderers. They always have a victim complex. They were hurt, they were wounded, they had to go and kill all those women. I mean, this is classic, deeply deranged behavior. It's about not taking responsibility as well, which is always a very big sign of a sick culture. Also, like, it's the geopolitical reflection of the internal reality. When you live in Russia, you're humiliated all the time. You're humiliated by the state, by your teachers, by your husband. It's a culture that is built on humiliation, deeply reflected in the literature, and in a way that internal humiliation is then sort of projected onto the outward. You know, so you don't say, you know, you come home, you've spent your day being humiliated by bureaucrats, cops, your boss, etc., etc., etc. You come home full of resentment, and then on the TV, Putin's saying, it's Obama who was humiliating you all day. So it's a way of actually just exporting internal tensions as well. But every Putin speech, like every Hitler speech, and often many Trump speeches, it really goes through one rhythm. He will start off as the humiliated Russian everyman. His body even does this. He does the sort of face, the sad face that Putin does. I'm a little boy. And we've been humiliated, and you're supposed to go, yes, I've been humiliated. And through the speech, he'll grow and grow and grow. And in the end, he is, you know, Agira, the god of wrath and anger, humiliating others. So you go on this emotional journey from a sort of depressed state to a state of dominance. And look, this is, you know, many psychoanalysts have analyzed Hitler speeches. They did the same thing. Putin does this kind of like slightly crappy Putin version of it, but it's very effective. And he's good at that. He performs every stage of the Russian everyman. I mean, the stories he tells himself, the way he was a taxi driver in the 90s, that's quite clever. It relates to so many people who had to go through many transformations in the 1990s, which they may have found humiliating. So again, he's playing into that sense of humiliation and then taking revenge.
Did that actually happen? I cannot imagine him driving a taxi. I
mean, like maybe a couple of times, people like did, like, you know, everyone's doing a bit of everything to get by. But I think the way he raises it is on purpose, of course, to identify himself with the humiliated 1990s.
Well, this is it. I mean, back in the 90s, everyone needed to earn a little bit of money because, you know, you weren't getting paid your wages. If you had a car, you had to fill it with fuel. If you ran out of money, well, what are you going to do with your car? It's going to sit there. So you'd stop and you'd pick anyone up. You'd be able to go onto the street and flag a car down. I got a ride with cops sometime. Quite worried that I might not get home, but no, the cops were earning a bit of money on the side by giving people a lift.
Exactly. So he was like basically a bodyguard. So why not? I think it's quite interesting because, you know, so as I said, I worked in entertainment TV. So one of the formats that the company I worked for tried to make was called Faking It, which is a very famous BBC and or Channel 4 entertainment show from the 90s, and then from the 2000s, sorry. And basically, you take a person or a celebrity, and they have to learn a new profession in like 2 days. So, like, you take a truck driver, they have to learn to become a chef, and, you know, the celebrity ones were very famous. So you take a footballer, and they have to learn how to be an engineer in 3 days, and they have to like convince a panel that they've done it. So they tried to do that show in Russia, and everyone was like, "Hold on, we just do this all the time. This is just like normal. What's the show? We don't get it." This is like, all of us did this all the time.
Where's the entertainment value?
We've all been through 30 professions in the 1990s to survive. Complete flop.
Yeah. What formats do work though? Because that's quite interesting. I mean, which ones did transition?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I can tell you what didn't work. Apprentice, complete fail, even though they, again, it was the company I worked with made it. Apprentice was a complete fail because they had a real oligarch, proper oligarch, Potanin, like proper scary oligarch, not like Trump, who's a con man. They're a proper oligarch, proper
Pucker,
money,
gold-plated toilet oligarch. Yeah.
No, Potanin is a real oligarch.
Yeah.
So they got like a good casting. You always get like basically the way it works is you buy the rights and like can't remember who makes The Apprentice. Is that BBC or so? I can't remember now. Anyway, but you have like producers come over and basically babysit the Russian production company through all the stages. So very well made, very well edited, great music, great storylines, complete and utter fail. Because that's not how Russians thought you make money. You don't make money by having I've got this very clever business idea and I'm going to sell it. That's not how it works. You make money by extortion, having connections in government, corruption, sleeping your way up. If you have a brilliant business idea, you end up in jail, because the bad boys come and take it away from you. So Apprentice, complete fail. The ones that did well were stuff like Survivor. So put people on desert islands and torture them. And Russians were like, oh yeah, this sort of reflects our experience, the gulag, humiliation. So anything based on humiliation and getting people to survive in extreme conditions, Russians were like, yeah, we know that.
We're up for that.
Those did very, very well.
That's very telling, isn't it? And I remember, because I used to translate and teach English for Finnish business people in St. Petersburg. And they had all sorts of incredible stories there. The president of the company was blown up. There's all sorts of fun stuff. But they also describe a story of when a Finnish businessman would invite, or they would be asked by Russian business people to come out and see how their businesses function, And of course, many of these businesses have been built up over generations, whether it be fish farms or whatever. It requires consistent investment year after year. And not taking too much out of the business in order for it to succeed. And of course, the Russians come out and are horrified, absolutely horrified at the idea that you can't make a quick profit out of it, and constantly asking questions. Well, what if we kill all the fish and create another business or do something else? And they just don't get that idea of generational investment.
Because they knew that they're sitting on a powder keg and you have no rights. And they were right. That's what I mean. My Russian friends, look, many of them are shocked about the invasion, but they always told me, they always knew that you better sell all your fish. You better be in a position to sell your fish at any point. They always knew something bad was going to happen. And they never bought the idea that Russia was on a path to reform. The only people who bought it were stupid foreigners like me. And even stupid foreigners like me could tell by, 2008, the invasion of Georgia was a massive wake-up call. But then the second arrest of Khodorkovsky, the second trial, was just so perverse that you were like, whoa, there is something dark going on. It was way beyond, it was so clinically perverse and purposefully perverse that it was, you could tell there was just some sickness was starting to infest what seemed to be hard, tough, rational men. There was also something very, very off as well.
Was that before, because Khodorkovsky's lawyer, no, sorry, it's Bill Browder, wasn't it? It's Bill Browder's lawyer who was, tortured. And,
so that was happening at the same time. But but that's, you should remember, that's exactly what happened. But Medvedev, who was president when I was there, came in saying he's going to investigate it. He was like, what a disgrace. He took Browder's side at first. We forget this. First, it was going to be, the new Russian government came in 2008, Medvedev, pro-NATO, pro-West, visiting Twitter offices. We forget there was this moment in 2008 when Russia was had put into place a president that was meant to be pro-Western. Now he's the most revanchist, ridiculous, comedically anti-Western little twerp. But then he was the opposite, and there was all this hope, and he went and saw Obama, and it was great, and all that crap. So we forget. No, so Medvedev said he would investigate this. He said this was a disgrace. This was terrible that lawyers were being killed.
I think with my cynical 90s head on, I was looking at that thinking, no, I don't buy a single word of that. But they actually, Bill Browder's lawyer, who incredibly intelligent man, not only was he horrifically, obviously murdered within the prison system, they then put him on trial, didn't they? Even though he was dead, they posthumously prosecuted him. And at that point, it gets medieval, doesn't it? I'm not even sure that Stalin prosecuted a dead person.
Yeah, there's an empty chair. No, I wrote about it. It was.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why medieval. It's more like something out of some sort of like bizarre comedy horror. No, but with a. I mean, why medieval? For me, it's not medieval. It's like out of some sort of like absurdist play about, an absurdist satire about dictatorships. And they're like, oh, let's play it. Or the Pussy Riot trial as well, which was consciously a trial of witches. They were being on trial for being witches. That was sort of playing at medievalism. But yeah, I remember writing about these things, and often I'd get sort of notes from readers saying, because that time I was writing already, and I'd get notes from readers saying, well, this can't be true. And I always said, when you live in Russia, then you realize that Bulgakov and Gogol are realists. And you live in this surreal space, but also because it's a very literary culture. Even its sadisms are played out with a lot of literary. Well, it's just somebody's thinking about it as a story at the same time. And we can spend a lot of time thinking why that is. But almost literary references are one of the few common signifiers that pull this chaotic culture together.
One of the few things, isn't it? Culture, and also the backwards looking nature. And I've spoken to so many Ukrainians now who talk about Ukrainian culture being essentially a forward looking, quite a dynamic and innovative culture. Russian culture is extraordinarily backward looking, nostalgic, in many ways idealistic. And I think you can see that in the Russian opposition. Sometimes you want to tear your hair out that there's a lack of maturity. There's a lack of even reflection there, and a lot of naivety, despite facing, I mean, if I ever get them on the channel, I'll put these questions to them. No success so far. But, they're facing the Siloviki, an organization which is a cross between, the worst of the mafia and the SS. And yet they're coming to it with a near childlike innocence in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I these terms, Russian liberals and Russian opposition, I don't find that very useful. You have to sort of break it down. There's different ones doing different things, and all of them politically impotent. But I don't like lumping them all together. It's very true if you look at the literature. So Volodymyr Yermolenko, a good friend of mine who's the head of Ukrainian PEN, pointed this out to me. If you look at the Russian literature of the 90s and 2000s, even the very good ones like Sorokin, they're very good at sort of deconstructing, the feces of Russian and Soviet culture. Literally, Sorokin is probably the most important Russian writer, has a book about a piece of shit walking around town. I mean, literally. So my reference to feces is not facetious. But they're very good at that. Mamleev, all these writers, they're very good at almost like these sort of doctors looking at a decomposed corpse and sort of prodding it and making sort of wry remarks about it. But none of those books have a capacity for imagining the future, while the Ukrainian literature, which is often full of sadness and despair, and the works of Zhadan and Andrew Hovich, always has a glimmer of the future. There's quite almost American-y about it sometimes. There's always a vision, a sad one through tragedy. With Zhadan, it's often a road, actually. He writes, roads play a very big role in his books, but there's a sense of a journey to somewhere. Not always clear where to, but there is a journey somewhere. There's a vision of somewhere that we're trying to get to. Even when it's through tears.
Even that most famous passage, probably one of the most famous passages in Russian literature about the Troika, heading off who knows where. But that's written by Ukrainian. I mean, that's Gogol, rather than
funny as well. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, there's a lot to sort of deconstruct about the Ukrainian impulse in Russian literature. It would be very, very interesting to start parsing that apart. Again, there's so much to do on the cultural front. And again, Russian intellectuals who are, most of the ones certainly that I know are very anti-Putin, have never really tried. I mean, there has been no, and I really hope this changes now, there's been no attempt to understand the imperial structures and underlying patterns in high Russian culture. There's only really one book about it, written by a Polish American, which costs $150. She's a professor at Florida University or something like that. But Russians haven't. It's been interesting because in England and America, one can sometimes say it goes too far. But when I was at university, all we did was deconstruct power and empire in English literature. I mean, that's kind of sometimes got a bit boring, but that's all we did. I think we were down to Jane Austen's hidden imperial patterns by the end, because she doesn't talk about the empire. But in everyone, that's all we did. We looked at power and power and empire, essentially.
And there's only one person who regularly talks about this stuff, and he does have a quite a strong audience, albeit with intelligence. That's Viktor Shenderovich, who of course has that Jewish perspective as well. I would say, you're slightly on the edge of society. You're able to take a step back and you're able to look at things in a more analytical way. And he regularly talks about the decolonization, fragmentation, and he deconstructs these kind of things.
That's great.
Also, Hodorkovsky, Jewish as well. I mean, there's a pattern, perhaps, of that slightly more rational way of looking at Russia's history. You can't be purely Russian to do it.
Well, nobody is. Yeah, very few people are. But I think you really need to. You always have good individual voices, but it hasn't become a mainstream of Russian literary criticism or something. Even though it's staring us in the face in many ways, in Tolstoy and in Pushkin, so I really hope that starts now. I hope the Russian intelligentsia, who do exist, I mean they're mostly abroad now, really start taking on that burden, because it's strange. I mean, whatever you might think of wokeism or all these things, it's good that American, British, French intellectual classes spend a lot of our time deconstructing our own evils that are encoded within even our most glorious whatever culture. It's good that we do that. I think that's a sign of a healthy society. In Russia, there is still this tradition of deifying dead writers, which again it's like the literary version of the death cult of Stalin and Lenin. It's like, let us pray to the corpse of Pushkin. It's like, no, can we stop praying to corpses? Whether liberal corpses or illiberal corpses, can we just stop praying to corpses? Can we understand what we need to learn from them, understand what they did wrong, and can we move on? Which is what normal cultures do. And I always found that weird, this bizarre deification of Pasternak, of Pushkin. Pushkin nasze всё. Pushkin is everything to us. Kind of creepy. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and we can talk about political opposition, all that kind of stuff. That's really hard in a dictatorship, but there is absolutely nothing stopping a new generation of Russian thinkers really getting to grips with I'm going to call it evil, with the evil or the prejudices that lead to evil that are there even within what's thought of as the humanistic tradition of Russian culture.
Another thing to get to grips with, I think, and it sort of emerges from some of the stuff you said earlier, and obviously from reading and rereading your books many times, and that is the extraordinary compartmentalisation. Because if you look at much of Russian propaganda, speaking to experts on Russian propaganda, we tend to think quite naively that people will watch these agitation formats, they'll listen to Solovyov and Simonyan, and they'll believe word by word. But that's not how it works, is it? I mean, first of all, not everyone watches these programs or even knows who, say, Simonyan is. But secondly, it's an entertainment format, so people will know they're being lied to. But they'll listen to it and they'll take away from it what they want to take away from it, the things that sort of maybe pander to their desires and whatever, and the rest is almost like background noise. As shocking as it is to us, because most of what's being said on these programs just reeks of immorality and toxic attitudes and layers of lies upon lies, and yet they spew out ideas that even in the same sentence will contradict each other, and to our minds that kind of jars. But it doesn't quite seem to necessarily jar, seeing all these conflicting narratives to every Russian.
Yeah, they're complete. Well, firstly, they're kind of bilibirda, which is a lovely Russian word. They're kind of this nonsense of arguments. It's something that you hear in Russia all the time. So that's not. No one's looking for ideological consistency in the first place. They've grown up with so many different belief systems and paradigms that being consistent isn't really a value. No one's looking for consistency. Doesn't reflect their lives. But you're quite right. Look, I mean, it's not that unusual. I mean, I live in America. It's shock jocks. I mean, the point of these shows say really outrageous, scary things that get the audiences in. They're shock jocks. I mean, so in that sense, if you know the American experience, then it's not that much of a not that new. What's interesting is that it's sponsored by the state, supported by the state, you know, and pushed by the state. So these kind of shows, they get around 30% in. They are quite famous, these presenters. They do have very high profiles. They're not, but the shows are watched by around 30%. The ratings are dipping at the moment. So that means they have to get more and more shocking. So yeah, people watch it as dark entertainment and as a license to hate. Really, that's what they're doing. They're giving you a license to hate. That's what a lot of propaganda does. It allows you to articulate and express taboo feelings that in normal society need to hide, and suddenly it's okay to hate, to want to murder. You know, that's what propaganda. That's the propaganda trick of propaganda, to take what you feel already and steer it and validate it, and then make it profitable to the people doing it. So yeah, no one's really like following every word, but there is a consistent worldview, which is a conspiratorial worldview. That is consistent. The conspiracy changes, the nature of the conspiracy changes. One day it's NATO, then it's the British Secret Service, then it's the Jews, then it's someone else. I mean, but the conspiratorial worldview is there. The way that kind of excuses responsibility is there. That we live in a dog-eat-dog world where Putin might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, is there. So there are kind of underlying worldviews which are fairly consistent, even though you're quite right that, you know, 1 minute, you know, we want to make peace, the next one want to make war. 1 minute we're invading Ukraine to get rid of Nazis, then we're doing it because of NATO. It's always changing. So yeah, it's pretty chaotic.
Putin has a sort of problem though, doesn't he? Because a lot of the propaganda effort until recently internally has been to stoke apathy and indifference, is to make sure people are apolitical, don't group together, don't take action, don't believe in anything, don't even believe there's such a thing as objective truth. A lot of it's there to say, look, you know, it might be bad here, and we might be a load of the world's worst, you know, a-holes, but it's like that everywhere. So don't think there's somewhere else better. Now suddenly he's needing to pivot. Now suddenly he's needing people to take action, to follow through on their nationalistic feelings and go and fight on Ukrainian soil. That's kind of changing the dynamic, isn't it, of his informational regime?
Yeah, it is. And I think they're going, I think they're in a very, very vulnerable place. You're quite right. It's not just that. I mean, without a doubt, he's going from propaganda of apathy to trying to stoke motivation. There's not that much motivation, let's be honest. He just needs enough soldiers to go and die. I mean, they're still quite happy for the rest to be apathetic. There are no signs of the war in Moscow, by the way. There are no posters, nothing, as if it doesn't exist. So no, for a lot of people, he's still trying to keep them in a sort of like, stay at home, drink your beer, you know, whatever, stare at and watch some TV shows. But he does need at least a certain amount to be mobilized, and he's trying to instill this patriotic education, which, by the way, is failing largely. Like, people aren't attending these courses. So you're right, they're in a vulnerable place, but they're in a vulnerable place for another reason as well, which is deeply related. I mean, the deal was always propaganda on TV, buy into it to a certain extent, but definitely play into it, but then get on with your personal life. Now that's changing. It was basically a system that was also based on a pyramid of corrupt mutual interest. You know, you could always make your money in different ways throughout the system, and they kind of let you alone to do that, and you could be as corrupt as you needed to be as long as you swore fealty when it mattered. That was the deal. And that's being replaced with something which is much more Stalinist, something which, you're quite right, requires motivation and pulling together and sacrifice. And it's very unclear whether they're going to be able to manage that. I mean, they're still very much in transition, and we'll see. That's a fairly big transitional moment, and we'll see how that plays out for them.
And it's a time where Putin himself is physically weakening, and also potentially sort of strategically weakening within society, or rather within the elite, which is far more important. So it is a pivotal moment. I mean, I know we're sort of running out of time, but one one question I wanted to throw at you, which sort of looks at the sort of slightly bigger picture outside of Moscow, because it's really easy to get obsessed with Russia and forget that actually, Ukraine is a victim here, and Ukraine has developed extraordinary techniques and resilience to counter Russian propaganda. And one of the reasons actually I changed this channel was actually so we could learn from the Ukrainian experience, so that we in the West could adapt and learn to fight it. And you wrote a fascinating article recently which suggests that despite the general hostility towards Putin, there are aspects of his narratives, aspects of his projection that are still getting into our heads, and we have to fight that. So I'm interested to hear your view on that.
I've been writing a lot since the war started, so that can be I don't know which particular piece you're referring to.
I think this was like from 3 weeks ago. You must write a lot. You I think
yeah, I mean, yes. But I mean, I'm happy to answer that question even without referencing the piece. I think so yeah, I get asked a lot because I sort of focus on propaganda. So I get asked a lot about, like, which Kremlin disinformation is really important, and I don't think we're into that. I don't think that's the important thing now. I mean, obviously they're putting out stuff about, atrocities were staged and all this sort of nonsense, which works with a tiny bunch of people. But there is a bigger one, a bigger narrative, which I think is there, which is kind of the inevitability of Russia. That, we're always going to be addicted to its oil. We're always going to be addicted to its gas. We have to make peace with it because it's big and strong and forever. And whatever happens, we're going to have to bend the knee. And that's very prevalent. I think that goes very deep also because it's a tough question. It's not easy to cut yourself off from Russia. I think Germany has proved that it can become independent of Russian energy within 1 year, which is pretty stunning. We need a lot more of that. We need to really cut Russia off like an abusive partner or an abusive neighbor. And it will be expensive. It will be tough, but it's really, really important. You can't stick around an unreliable, abusive, and psychotic sort of partner. So
we have to, I mean, they'll carry on as well, mounting information assault, because it's unlikely Russia will suddenly become a liberal democracy. It's unlikely it'll suddenly forego attacking or trying to control and coerce its neighbors. So it does look like we need to build our defenses up for the long term, because this problem won't go away.
No, it won't go away. And depending on how well they do, there'll be a lesson for China, obviously. And we're seeing Russia and China combine forces in the information space, supporting each other's narratives and so on. That doesn't mean they're allies, but they are sort of partners of convenience. And we've seen them joined by Iran. And I think that authoritarian network will expand. So yeah, it's going to be a pretty bumpy 21st century. On the upside, I think we've seen democracies pulled together for the first time. I think Ukraine has reminded so many people of why our political values exist, that they're worth fighting for. So Ukraine is a huge inspiration for us all, apart from just being the front line in this battle. So I don't think we should be scared of Russia in any way. I do think obviously we do need to start thinking of, once Ukraine has won this war to the extent that it wants to and can, how do we guarantee its security so Russia can't do it again? We have to, the working assumption has to be that whoever is in charge of Russia, they're going to try this again in 2 years or 10 years. It doesn't matter. And the question is, how do we make Ukraine, Moldova, maybe Georgia, if Georgia wants to, as secure as Poland and Estonia? Mm-hmm. That's the only way it's going to happen. I mean, Kazakhstan seems to have the protection of China now, which is why Russia sticks out of there. But that's really the question we need to start answering. And whether that's de facto NATO entry, de jure NATO entry, something else, the only way this calms down is if Russia knows that the deterrence is so big it's not worth the effort. Poland and Estonia used to be as vulnerable as Ukraine. They're not anymore. So that's what we've got to get to. And even though that, there's going to be a lot of people who push back against that, that's also better for our security. It's cheaper because things are more stable. And yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in Russia. We're going to make sure that it can't attack Ukraine and others again.
And I think that reminded us, and especially Ukraine's experience has reminded us, that democracy isn't inevitable and it isn't eternal. that actually requires an enormous amount of thought and continuous work to evolve it, and that it could disappear. And to an extent, this will upset maybe some of my audience, because I know I've got a mixed audience, but even the Trump experience suggests that representational democracy will come under threat, and we have to build in resilience and a consciousness of that.
Yes, no, I agree with those words. I just wonder what it means in practice.
That should be the subject of a next conversation. I've got through about a quarter of my questions, and I know we've almost reached the end, because I know you have to pop off. This was, I think our audience are actually going to love this. I mean, it was something I was looking forward to for a very long time, and I'm deeply grateful that you've spent the time to share your experience with us.
Great questions, and we should continue. I agree. I mean, I completely agree with you, Jonathan. I want to start thinking what that means. What I'm thinking about, what does it mean in the information space? What sort of policies do we need? What institutions do we need? In the Second World War, the British had the political warfare executive that dealt with propaganda, essentially. Good propaganda, maybe propaganda for good, but it thought about information security and influence. In the Cold War, the US had the US Information Agency. What would be the versions today? We keep on waiting for media to solve this issue, and I don't think that's media's job.
No. In fact, the Ukrainians that I've spoken to have showed me that, they all said exactly the same thing. There was a problem. It was obvious. It was right in front of their faces, and they were waiting for government to solve it. And then they realized that no one was going to come and bail them out. So you have this extraordinary sort of self-generating people grasping authority and saying, no, I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to figure out a way to do it. And not all those solutions worked. But I think that for me is a real lesson of what, certainly the Maidan generation seems to have done, is they've gone out and they've innovated a bunch of sort of political journalistic techniques to create the freedom we see here, and not turn it into a Belarus, which is the alternative path I think that Ukraine could have gone down.
Yes, that too. I mean, Ukraine is an example, an inspiration in so many ways, and in that way as well.
Thank you so much, Peter. This has been a real pleasure.
Bye.
Slava Ukraine.